This is a 500-year-old Ming saber blade. You may have seen a recent video, long form video recorded over in Longquan in a tea house there, how to buy a Chinese sword, what collectors are looking for. I'll put the link for that below. I briefly showed this Dao blade when I was there in Longquan, but I wanted to take a little deeper dive on it because, especially for those who really love this topic and are interested in Chinese sabers, I think this is a really interesting piece. A lot of people would refer to something like this as an old soldier. Some people might say, why in the world would you buy that piece of junk? I would call this an old treasure for a number of reasons. One is, of course, that age. And we can tell that by looking at the Tang here. It's at minimum 400, but really it's like a 500-year-old blade. And also, let's take a note while we're at it. A lot of people have a misunderstanding or think that Chinese swords, because they may have seen a more modern one that has a little, what they call rat tail Tang, it's a little thin Tang. You can see that's a good, solid, robust Tang. So they're not thin, they're not rat tail at all. That's very typical of a Tang on a Chinese Dao or Jin. That's good and solid and thick like that. And I'm gonna come back to a detail here that's really interesting. I just learned about myself. Always gotta keep learning. What I find really interesting about these blades is the form itself. Look at that tip, it's obviously quite rounded now. This would have come to like an arrowhead kind of tip. This style of blade, this sort of shape is referred to as generally these days as a Yanchi Dao, a goose wing saber. I've also heard them called a phoenix wing saber, a feng shi Dao. I haven't found that in any old text, but that's how they're generally referred to today by collectors. A more kind of official term, because you do have some inscriptions on some, is a Gong Dao, which means it's a government department Dao, that these were made for the military. So we should always keep that in mind. Most swords were not made for the individual, just like most rifles today are, vast majority are military rifles made for soldiers. Same thing was true of blades during the Ming and the Qing. This one also, if you take a look at that, has a very broad pattern. So this was almost like tool steel. It's not a super fine pattern. It's indicative of a blade made for a soldier, made to be used. You don't have to fold things so it has thousands of layers or whatever to make it really good. That's enough folds to make it solid, to work out impurities and have the qualities of the harder and softer steel in the walls of the sword. But talking about the shape of the blade, I always found this a very interesting shape because they tend to be rather heavy and thick down the bottom here. Obviously, this is 500 years later. This one's seen, it's obviously slimmed down over time. You can barely see what looks to be a little hints here and there of the hardened edge, but there's places where the hardened edge is completely worn away. So I would say this was probably a good 1/4 inch wider, so 4 or 5 millimeters wider, and obviously much thicker. But this basic shape is still here, so we can learn a lot from that. Mentioned this tip. Now, what's interesting about this tip, this would have been a really arrow shape, is that that point of the saber is on line with the grip. With later sabers, typically like a willow leaf saber or the oxtail saber that most people are familiar with, the way the blade curves up, you rarely can't use a tip. You can only use it for an upward thrust or maybe if you're using a jaw downward. This phoenix wing, or more commonly called the goose wing, that tip is in line with the grip, with the hilt. So you can deliver an effective solid thrust with this type of saber, which is one reason why these were very popular in the beginning of the Ming Dynasty through the middle of the Ming Dynasty, and then they just seemed to disappear. And I always thought that's a great idea, that you can give a good solid thrust. So I wonder why it didn't stay longer. The other thing is that it has this raised central ridge. It's not quite on the center, of course. It's about 1/4 of the way back. And that's a feature that many people associate, of course, with Japanese blades. But that feature was originally on Chinese swords and strongly influenced by steppe sabers. You can go back to the 10th century, even earlier, and find sabers for the Khazar people. And I generally call them Turco-Mongol steppe sabers, which is a really big term. It means that all those people running around the steppe who had sabers, they interchanged a lot. they had this sort of faceted cross-section of blade with that ridge line that later was adapted onto Japanese swords. So these Ming swords had this as well, and I think that's really more the influence of the Mongol sabers. Ming military in general, Ming martial arts, archery, all kinds of things, was strongly influenced by the Mongols. So that's probably a Mongol influence or a steppe influence. But that also makes this an efficient cutter because, I mean, again, imagine this blade is wider, at least 5 mil, quarter-inch wider. When that cutting edge is, driving its way through the target, any part of the material that you're cutting through that is rubbing on the blade, that's intact with the blade, is friction, right? There's gonna be friction there, and that slows down the cut, making it less efficient. By beveling this back from that, that's about a quarter way down the blade, by beveling back this way, you increase the cutting efficiency because now a quarter less surface is touching your target material, which is usually flesh. We don't talk to say that. So that's a really good part of the design. So I've always found these very interesting because, this would have been a period, early Ming, when people were in armor. And this kind of tip, was it armor piercing? I'm gonna have to get a recreated one sometime and some good solid period armor and give a good solid thrust number of ways and see if I can pierce the armor, what kind of damage I can do. But I suspect that was the case. They're not particularly curved. They tend to be relatively straight and curved, just so this one does curve, accelerate at the end. So you get a little more cutting efficiency there, but you also have that very powerful percussive cut, which in armor, you're not cutting somebody in armor, you're striking them. So you get a good solid percussive cut. So it seems to me a great saber design, and I have no idea why they stopped using it. I want to go back and get some good recreated ones, probably do it through 7-Star Swords. We'll probably get that and we'll get some armor and we'll give it a test. So in the future, come back for that. What thing I learned, I mentioned here earlier, the Tang. When I was in Longquan, I was talking to smiths at the forges that we work with, and I had this with me, so I showed it to them because, of course, the Chinese smiths in Longquan are very interested in antique swords. Many of the swords that we offer through 7 Stars are, in fact, replicas of swords in those people's collections, in the Smiths collections. So we got really good, historically accurate swords. And so I wanted to share this with them because I knew they would appreciate and enjoy it, and they really did. But I always had seen this before, and quite honestly, I didn't give it really much thought. There's so much going on. As I'm sure you're probably realizing, I tend to look at swords as a swordsman. How does it handle? How did that tip affect it? How did the shape and the weight and the balance point, how would that affect its handling? How would I have wielded this sword in a duel or if I'm on the front lines or facing the Mongols? So I'm generally looking at that aspect of a sword. And I had noticed, there's these little notches here. You can just see, I can just kind of feel it. There's a little bump there, a little where, the shoulders of the Tang come in. It's generally about a 90-degree angle, but right at the base, top and bottom, is another little bump up. And I'd seen that many times and quite honestly, didn't really give it any thought, because I'm not a smith, I'm a swordsman. But I showed this to the smiths and they go, oh, you see that? That's on government blades. And what that's used for is when you slip the guard onto the husho, the guard onto there, it's going to be loose. Again, remember, this is a Gong Dao, a government department Dao. In other words, this like military procurement department is making these. The guys who are pounding out the blades are just pounding out blades, and they're making them to a pattern, and they're making them probably as fast as they can. But if you're not making these like, this is a boutique sword, so to speak. I'm making this, forging this blade, and I'm making this fittings for that customer, and it's all going to be perfect. You're mass producing. And so there's got to be that tolerance, meaning when you slip the husho over that, there's going to be space there. How did they tighten it up? And I think any collector can tell you, you get an old Dao, that guard is almost always rattling and loose. How did they fix that? How did they deal with that? Once they put it on, they use these little notches. They put a little wire, a brass wire, inside there to tighten that up. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I learned something really cool today. And that particular forge, when they're making they do the Scott Rodell collection, they do that with their swords to keep it nice and tight. So I was really happy to learn something new all the time. Anyway, they are 500-year-old old soldier. I would say old treasure. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe. Maybe hit that join button for us. Stay strong, everybody. 再见.